Welcome to a deep dive into the Meiji Restoration. We're going to see how Japan went from, well, a feudal society to a major world power, and all in just a few decades. It's
hmm
kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. You've
Yeah.
given us some really fascinating source material, too, so I'm excited to unpack it all.
Yeah, it really is a period of intense change, and it's interesting to see how Japan, facing all this pressure from the West, they chose to kind of adapt and transform rather than just give in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so before we get into all the crazy changes that happened during the Meiji period, can we maybe paint a picture of what Japan was like before all this? Like, set the scene for us.
Right, yeah. We need to sort of set the stage. Imagine Japan before 1868, so under the Tokugawa shogunate. It's a feudal society, behind the times in terms of technology, and pretty much isolated from, well, everyone else.
So it sounds almost like a different world compared to the Japan we know today.
Oh, it definitely was. The shogun, he was the one with the real power, with the emperor, more like a symbolic figurehead. This system had been around for centuries, but it was about to go through a huge shakeup.
And that shakeup was triggered by, at least in part, by the arrival of all those Western powers, right?
Exactly, yeah. Western nations, especially the United States, they forced Japan to sign these unequal treaties, basically giving them control over trade and even some parts of Japan's legal system. It was a huge blow to their pride and, well, their independence.
So how did the Meiji Restoration actually happen then? Did the Japanese people just kind of wake up one day and decide, hey, let's overthrow the shogun?
Well, no, it wasn't that simple. There are like a lot of factors involved, but one really important element was this growing feeling of national humiliation and a real desire to modernize, to resist the West's influence. There was this group of young samurai, and they would later become important figures in the Meiji government, but they really saw what was coming. They knew Japan had to change or, well, it might not survive.
So these samurai, they basically led a coup.
Yeah, that's one way to put it. In 1868, they overthrew the shogunate and restored Emperor Meiji to power. And the name Meiji itself, it means enlightened rule, which kind of hints at the huge changes that were about to happen.
And it really was a huge transformation. The sources you shared, they show all these political, economic, and social reforms. It's a lot. Where do we even start?
Okay, well, politically, one of the biggest changes was setting up a central government. The Meiji leaders, they got rid of the old feudal domains, replaced them with prefectures, and then they also created a constitution and a bicameral parliament called the Diet.
Sounds like they were taking inspiration from Western governments.
They were, but they were also careful about what they borrowed. They adapted those Western ideas to fit Japan, creating a unique system.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes the Meiji Restoration so interesting, this whole mixing of tradition and modernity.
Totally. And it wasn't just about the political stuff either. They knew that economic power was crucial if they wanted to be a strong nation.
So how did they go about that?
They went all in on industrialization. They put tons of money into railroads, telegraph lines, factories, all that. And they also encouraged private investment, which led to these powerful business groups called zaibatsu.
Zaibatsu, I'm not familiar with that. What exactly were those?
Think of them like family-controlled industrial empires. They had their hands in pretty much every part of the economy. They were a big part of why Japan's economy grew so fast, but they also had a lot of political influence.
It's incredible how quickly they managed to build up their industries. And I imagine all this economic change had a big impact on Japanese society, right?
It definitely did. The Meiji leaders, they knew that modernization wasn't just about factories and railroads. It was about, like, changing the entire country's mindset.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they needed people who were educated, who
Right.
could adapt, and who were patriotic, right? So
Sure.
they introduced universal education, which was a pretty radical idea back then. It meant that everyone, no matter what social class they were from, could go to school.
That's a huge change from the feudal system where only the elites really got an education.
Exactly. They also really pushed this idea of duty to the emperor and the nation. They promoted Shinto, which is Japan's native religion, with its belief that the emperor was descended from gods, as a way to unify the country and make their reforms seem, well, legitimate.
So they were using the emperor as a symbol of unity, even though he didn't have much real power.
Yeah, that's right. They used this existing respect for the emperor to rally people behind their big plan for modernization. Think about it. If you believe your leader is, like, descended from gods, you're more likely to follow them, even if it means big changes.
That's fascinating. It's like how they used ideology and symbols to get what they wanted politically. But I'm guessing not everyone was happy with all these changes, right?
Well, of course not. The Meiji Restoration was a time of huge upheaval. Not everyone was on board with how fast things were changing. And one of the most dramatic examples of this resistance was the Satsuma Rebellion in 1877.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, it was led by this guy, Saigo Takamori, a samurai, who had actually supported the Meiji Restoration at first, but then became disillusioned with the direction the country was going. He felt like Japan was losing its soul, its traditions, by becoming so westernized.
So he decided to rebel against the Meiji government.
He did, and what's really interesting is that it wasn't just about political power. It was a clash between the old and the new, between the traditional samurai and the modern Meiji army.
And how did that clash turn out?
The Meiji government, with its new weapons and tactics, they crushed the rebellion. Saigo Takamori died in the fighting, and he became a kind of tragic hero for people who missed the old ways.
So it sounds like this rebellion was kind of a turning point, a symbol of the end of the feudal era in Japan.
It was. The Meiji government, by winning, showed how strong they were and proved the power of their modern army. It also sent a clear message. The samurai, they were a thing of the past. The future belonged to a new, modern Japan.
So they successfully modernized Japan, but what about their place in the world? You said earlier they wanted to break free from Western dominance. Did they manage to do that?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting. Japan's modernization allowed them to become a major power in Asia, but it also led to new tensions and conflicts, especially with their neighbors.
So they went from being victims of imperialism to becoming imperialists themselves.
Sadly, yeah. They started doing a lot of the same things that they had resented from Western powers. They wanted to expand their territory, their influence, and their access to resources.
And where did all this new ambition take them?
It led them into a bunch of conflicts that would eventually reshape Asia and have huge consequences for Japan's future.
This is all so captivating. We'll definitely need to pick up this thread in part 2.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll dig into Japan's rise as a major power and all the challenges they faced.
Okay, so be sure to join us for the next part of our exploration, where we'll get into Japan's imperial ambitions and the events that eventually led to World War II. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Meiji Restoration. Last time, we were talking about how Japan had really modernized and was starting to, show its strength on the world stage.
Yeah, they had definitely become a power to be reckoned with, but all that newfound power, it kind of led them down a complicated and sometimes, well, kind of a troubling path.
You mentioned they were starting to act like the Western imperialists, the ones they resented.
Yeah.
So where did that new assertiveness lead them?
Well, one of the biggest turning points was the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894.
Right, that war was in the sources you gave us. What was the main issue there?
It was all about control of Korea. Both Japan and China, they saw Korea as strategically important and, well, their rivalry over it eventually led to war.
And what happened? Who won?
Japan did. They had this modern military, and they totally defeated China. It was a huge shock to the world and showed everyone just how strong Japan had become. It also really changed the balance of power in Asia.
So they got what they wanted. They got influence over Korea.
Yeah.
But what about their relationship with the West? Did this win make them look better to the Western powers?
Not really. Actually, it kind of had the opposite effect. The Western powers, they were actually worried about Japan's growing ambition, started seeing them as a potential threat. It's like the powers that be never like it when someone new comes in and shakes things up.
It's like Japan was always trying to get recognized as an equal on the world stage, but kept getting pushback from those already in power.
Yeah, that's been a recurring theme in Japan's modern history. They were so determined to prove themselves, but they often met resistance, even hostility from the West.
So what happened next? Did that tension with the West keep growing?
It did, and it eventually led to another big conflict, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904.
Another war. What caused that one?
Well, again, it was mainly about Korea. Russia had been increasing its influence in East Asia, and Japan saw that as a direct threat to what they wanted.
So Korea was like a hot spot back then, geopolitically speaking.
No, yeah, definitely. It was a really important place in Asian power politics. And for Japan, control of Korea wasn't just about looking good, it was about their own safety and security.
So they went to war with Russia. That seems like a really bold move. I mean, Russia was this giant empire.
It was a huge risk, but it paid off. Japan beat Russia, and the whole world was stunned.
Wow, that's amazing. A small island nation beating one of the biggest empires in the world. That must have really shaken things up internationally.
It really did. The Russo-Japanese War was a turning point. It solidified Japan's status as a major power, and they finally earned a seat at the table in international diplomacy. It also had a big impact on how they saw themselves as a nation.
How so?
Well, the victory over Russia gave them this feeling of national pride, a real surge in confidence. But, and this is the downside, it also contributed to a growing sense of militarism.
You mentioned that militaristic feeling was already growing in Japan. Did this victory over Russia make it worse?
It did, yeah. The military's prestige and influence grew, and they started to have more say in Japan's foreign policy.
So even as Japan was modernizing and becoming more democratic in some ways, they were also becoming more militaristic at the same time.
Yeah, that's the weird thing about this period. Japan was making progress economically, educationally, even politically, but they were also becoming more aggressive and expansionist in their foreign policy.
And that tension between democracy and militarism, it really came to a head during the Taisho period, right? We talked about it a little bit last time, but I'd love to hear more.
Okay, yeah. The Taisho period, it was from 1912 to 1926, and it was a time of big social and political change for Japan. A lot of people call it the era of Taisho democracy.
Okay, so what was happening in Japan that led to this period of, well, more democratic openness?
Well, Emperor Meiji, the guy who was behind the Meiji Restoration, he died in 1912. His son, Emperor Taisho, wasn't as involved in politics, so that kind of created a power vacuum.
So with the emperor stepping back, other groups could step up.
Exactly. Political parties started to have more influence, and there was this surge in democratic ideas and practices. People had more freedom of speech, more freedom of the press, and political parties started playing a bigger role in running the country.
Was this a sudden change, or did it happen gradually?
It was gradual, building on what they had started during the Meiji period. But World War I also played a part.
How so?
Well, Japan was on the side of the Allies in World War I, and that actually helped their economy. They became a major supplier to the Allies, and that economic boom created a more affluent middle class.
So people had more money, more free time, and maybe more time to think about things like politics and individual rights.
Exactly. That new prosperity combined with this global wave of democratic enthusiasm after World War I, it created the perfect conditions for Taisho democracy to really take off.
So what were some of the big achievements of this period?
One of the biggest was giving more people the right to vote. In 1925, all men over 25 could vote. It was a huge step towards democracy, but unfortunately, women still couldn't vote.
It's interesting that even during this time of, well, relative openness, there were still limits on who could participate in democracy.
Yeah, Taisho democracy wasn't perfect. There were still limits on free speech, and the military still had a lot of power behind the scenes.
And I have a feeling this period of democratic experimentation didn't last.
You're right, unfortunately. Taisho democracy had a promising start, but it turned out to be pretty fragile.
What happened? Why did it decline?
A few things contributed to its downfall. One big blow was the economic depression that hit Japan in the late 1920s.
Oh, right, the Great Depression. That was a global thing, and it had terrible consequences everywhere.
It really did. The depression caused so much hardship in Japan, unemployment, social unrest, and people started losing faith in democratic institutions.
It seems like when there's an economic crisis, people are more likely to turn to extreme ideologies.
That's a good point. The economic downturn made people feel vulnerable and desperate, and nationalist and militarist groups used that to their advantage. They blamed the West for Japan's economic problems and said Japan needed to go back to traditional values and have a more aggressive foreign policy.
So that's when the seeds of discontent were sown, during those hard times.
Yeah, you could say that. And those seeds would grow into something much more dangerous. As the economy got worse, the military got more powerful, and they started to control the government more and more.
So it sounds like Japan was at a crossroads. They had experienced democracy, but they were also dealing with economic problems and this resurgent militarism.
That's a great way to put it. And the path they chose would have huge consequences, not just for Japan, but for the whole world.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Meiji Restoration. We've talked about how Japan transformed from a feudal society to a modern industrial and military power. But we've also seen that this rapid modernization, well, it wasn't all smooth sailing. It came with its own set of problems and contradictions.
Yeah, you're right. Remember those seeds of discontent we talked about, the ones sown during the economic hardship of the late 1920s? Well, those seeds, they eventually grew, and they led Japan down a road of militarism and aggression.
So let's get into that darker chapter in Japan's history. How did a country that had embraced modernization, that had even tried out democracy, how did they end up in World War II?
Okay, well, one thing that's really important to remember is that even though Japan was modernizing, The West still treated them differently. They still experienced discrimination and exclusion.
So it's like they were told to modernize, to play by the rules of the international system, but even when they did, they still weren't treated as equals.
Exactly. They were denied equal status, shut out of markets, treated like a second-class nation, and all that resentment, it fueled this growing sense of nationalism and gave the military a lot of power to push their agenda.
And their agenda was?
The military was saying that Japan needed to secure its own resources, that it needed to create its own sphere of influence in Asia, and that they should use force if they had to. They pointed to the Western powers, and how they were imperialists, to justify their own expansionist ambitions.
So did Japan's leaders actually agree with this militaristic vision?
More and more they did. The military's influence in the government grew, and they started steering Japan towards a more aggressive foreign policy.
Were there any early signs of this shift towards aggression?
Well, yeah, in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. It's a resource-rich region in northeastern China. It was a really clear act of aggression. The League of Nations condemned it, but Japan just ignored everyone and set up a puppet state there.
So it's like they were testing the limits, seeing what they could get away with.
That's a good way to put it. And unfortunately, they didn't face enough pushback to stop them. The League of Nations couldn't do anything, and the Western powers, they were too busy with their own problems, like the Great Depression.
So since they got away with it in Manchuria, they just kept expanding.
Yeah, they did. In 1937, they invaded all of China, starting the Second Sino-Japanese War. This conflict dragged on for years and years, using up a ton of resources and just brutalizing both countries.
How did the world react to this escalation?
Well, the League of Nations condemned it again, and some Western powers put economic sanctions on Japan, but it was too little, too late. Japan felt isolated and resentful. They were convinced that the West was trying to hold them back to prevent them from becoming powerful.
So they just became more and more militaristic.
They did, and their actions got riskier. By the late 1930s, they were allied with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, forming the Axis powers. They were stuck in their war with China and desperately needed resources to keep their military going.
Resources that were getting harder and harder to find because of the sanctions.
Right. And Japan saw the United States as a big problem. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was based in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, and Japan wanted to expand into Southeast Asia, which had lots of oil and rubber.
So they decided to take a chance, a really big chance.
Yeah. On December 7th, 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor. They wanted to destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet and open the way for their expansion.
And that backfired, as we all know.
Oh, it definitely did. The attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into World War II, and that really changed everything for Japan. The war in the Pacific was awful. So many people died on both sides.
And Japan ended up losing badly.
Yeah. In August 1945, after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. It was the end of World War II.
So looking back at all this, at all the ups and downs, what can we say about the Meiji Restoration? Was it a success or a failure?
That is a really tough question. It's complicated. On the one hand, because of the Meiji Restoration, Japan became a modern, industrialized country that could compete with the rest of the world. They achieved their goal of avoiding colonization and became a major power.
But on the other hand, that rapid modernization also unleashed these forces of nationalism and militarism that led them into a disastrous global war. It's almost like a Greek tragedy, Their strengths led to their downfall.
That's a great comparison. The Meiji leaders wanted to make Japan strong and protect it, but they also started things that they couldn't control.
So it's a mixed legacy, a story of great achievements and terrible consequences.
Exactly. It shows us that modernization isn't always a straightforward path to peace and prosperity. It's a process, and it's full of challenges and contradictions. The choices made along the way, they can have huge and often unexpected effects.
This deep dive has been so insightful. You've really given us so much to think about, and I know our listeners will be thinking about all this long after this episode is over.
I agree. It's a period that's both fascinating and challenging, and it's a story that's still relevant today as we deal with globalization, nationalism, and the pursuit of power in a world that's changing so fast.
Absolutely. Well, this wraps up our deep dive into the Meiji Restoration. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. We hope you learned as much as we did.
And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
That's what we're all about here on the Deep Dive. We'll see you on our next Deep Dive adventure.